Welcome back, friends. Tonight I'm bringing you stories that might just make you question everything you think you know about what's safe, what's real, and who to trust. From the frigid depths of the Alaskan wilderness to the shadowed corridors of haunted homes and the eerie whispers of small-town healers, these tales will take you on a journey you won't forget. So sit back, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for the unsettling truth hidden in the dark corners of our world. And if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps keep these tales coming. We thank you for your support. The cold below. I'd spent nearly a decade as a researcher in Anchorage, Alaska, studying permafrost and its impact on the region's ecosystem. Fieldwork could be brutal, especially in winter when temperatures plunged far below zero. But I was used to the cold, or at least I thought I was. A few months ago, our team got permission to conduct tests in a remote area known for ancient ice formations. The permafrost there was said to be thousands of years old, and no one had explored it in any significant way. I was excited. This was the kind of opportunity most researchers dream of. But when we arrived, there was an eerie stillness to the place, a silence that felt unnatural, even for the Alaskan wilderness. Our team of 4 set up camp on a frozen ridge and began drilling. At first, everything was routine. We extracted samples, measured temperature changes, and documented the layers of ice. But as we drilled deeper, our instruments began picking up unusual readings, temperature fluctuations that didn't make sense, and faint seismic activity despite there being no fault lines in the area. My colleague, Dr. Simmons, brushed it off as equipment error, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A day into the expedition, we drilled down to an unexpectedly soft layer, hidden beneath nearly 100 feet of solid ice. It was warmer than any surrounding material, which shouldn't have been possible given its depth. Simmons decided to push further even though protocol advised against it. He insisted it was a rare find, something we couldn't pass up. Around midnight, as I was logging data in our tent, Simmons burst in, his face pale. "You need to see this," he said, barely able to contain his excitement. He led me back to the site, where the drill had uncovered a strange chamber, hollowed out within the ice. There were no natural formations like this in our records. Yet here it was, a pocket of air trapped in ice for thousands of years, its walls lined with shimmering crystals that seemed to pulse with a faint blue glow. It was both beautiful and unsettling, like we'd stumbled upon something meant to stay hidden. Simmons lowered a camera into the chamber and we watched the feed on our monitor. At first, there was only darkness, the camera's light struggling to penetrate the void. But then, something moved. Just a flicker, a shadow passing in front of the lens. I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe even a reflection. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate movement, just out of frame. "Did you see that?" I whispered, not wanting to break the silence. Simmons nodded, his face tense. "Probably an air pocket or some debris shifting. Nothing to worry about." But his voice betrayed him. He was worried, maybe as much as I was. We decided to leave the site for the night, hoping the chamber would stabilize. As we walked back to our tents, I felt something cold brush against the back of my neck, a chill that went beyond the Alaskan winter. I turned, half expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, only the silent, snow-covered landscape stretching out beneath a dark sky. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that chamber, the shadows shifting in the dim light, like something was waiting for us. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps crunching in the snow outside my tent. I assumed it was Simmons, but when I looked out, I saw only darkness. The next morning, Simmons was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his gear untouched. We searched the area, calling his name, our voices swallowed by the endless snow. There were no footprints, no sign that he'd left the camp. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. I contacted the authorities, but a blizzard rolled in, cutting us off from any help. We were stranded, and with each passing hour, the sense of dread grew. I felt it in the air, a weight pressing down on me, as though something was watching us from the shadows. 2 nights after Simmons disappeared, I had a dream. I was back at the chamber, staring into the darkness, when I heard a voice, faint, distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. It was calling my name, a desperate whisper that sent chills down my spine. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, the voice echoing in my ears. The following day, our second team member Martin decided to return to the chamber, convinced that Simmons might have fallen in or gotten lost in the structure. I tried to stop him, but he was adamant, saying he'd heard Simmons calling for help during the night. He swore he could hear him beneath the ice, trapped and calling out. Against my better judgment, I joined him. As we approached the chamber, that strange blue glow had intensified, casting an eerie light over the snow. The air was freezing, colder than anything I'd ever felt, and I could see my breath crystallizing in front of me. Martin lowered himself down into the chamber with a rope, determined to find Simmons, or at least some clue to his disappearance. I waited above, holding the line, listening to his footsteps echo through the icy cavern. Then, the rope went slack. "Martin?" I called, my voice shaky. There was no response, only silence, stretching on until it became unbearable. I gripped the rope, debating whether to go in after him, when I heard it. The same faint whisper from my dream calling my name. A cold sweat broke over me and I backed away, heart racing. I could see shadows shifting in the glow, figures moving within the ice, their forms twisting and writhing like they were trapped, pressing against the walls as if trying to break free. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached camp. The storm hit later that night, cutting off any chance of rescue. I huddled in my tent, the wind howling outside, drowning out the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. For hours I lay there, listening to the voices calling my name, pleading for help, their tones full of a sorrow that chilled me to my core. When the storm finally passed, I was the only one left. Authorities found me 2 days later, disoriented and nearly hypothermic. I told them about Simmons and Martin, about the chamber and the voices, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to exhaustion and exposure, claiming my colleagues had likely gotten lost in the storm. But I know what I heard, what I saw in that chamber beneath the ice. Something ancient, something that had been buried for thousands of years was stirring, its whispers still echoing in my mind. Even now, back in Anchorage, I can feel the cold, the weight of those shadows pressing down on me, like they're waiting. And every night, in my dreams, I see the blue glow of the chamber, hear the faint voices calling from below, pleading, begging for release. The house at Harper's Bend. It was a lazy summer afternoon when we first heard about the house at Harper's Bend. I was 17, driving around with my friend Mason, bored out of our minds, when we passed the turnoff for the old Harper farm. The place had been abandoned for years and the locals had 1,000 rumors about why, most of them dark. "There it is," Mason said, nodding toward the faded sign half hidden by overgrown weeds. "You ever heard the stories about that place?" "Everyone has," I muttered, keeping my eyes on the road. The Harper family had been a legend in our small town, but not the kind of legend you bragged about. Whispers of inbreeding, strange births, and disappearances had surrounded the family for decades, and after the last of them had supposedly moved away, no one ever talked about them again. The house had sat empty, falling into disrepair. The locals said it was haunted, cursed, or worse. "You ever thought about going there?" Mason asked, a grin creeping across his face. The kind of grin that only comes from a mix of teenage boredom and stupidity. I shrugged. Not really. "Well, let's do it. You and me tonight." I knew better. But when you're 17 and your best friend suggests something reckless, you don't think it through. "Fine," I said, rolling my eyes. "But if we die, I'm blaming you." That night, we grabbed flashlights, hopped in my truck, and drove back out to Harper's Bend. The road was dark, barely lit by the moon, and I could feel my nerves building as we got closer. The house came into view, looming at the end of the narrow gravel driveway, its roof sagging under years of neglect. "Look at that thing," Mason said, his voice filled with excitement. It's like something out of a horror movie. We parked and got out. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of rot and overgrown grass. As we approached the house, the front porch creaked ominously, like it was warning us to turn back. "I don't like this," I muttered, but Mason was already pulling open the front door. It swung wide with a groan, revealing the dark, musty interior. The house smelled worse on the inside, like mold and something else I couldn't quite place. We shined our flashlights around, revealing peeling wallpaper, shattered windows, and overturned furniture. The place had clearly been left in a hurry. Mason was grinning ear to ear, his flashlight dancing across the walls. "Man, this place is awesome. Creepy as hell." I wasn't as thrilled. The deeper we went into the house, the more unsettled I felt. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant rustle, made my skin crawl. "Let's check upstairs," Mason suggested, already heading toward the staircase. "I don't know, man," I said, but of course he didn't listen. I followed him, the old wooden steps groaning under our weight as we made our way up. The second floor was worse. The smell was stronger and the air felt stifling, almost suffocating. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing old, decaying bedrooms, one of which had what looked like children's toys scattered across the floor. Mason bent down, picking up a small dust-covered doll. "Creepy," he said, laughing as he tossed it aside. That's when we heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from above us. We froze, our flashlights trained on the ceiling. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my heart racing. Mason nodded, his grin finally fading. "Yeah, probably just raccoons in the attic." But the footsteps kept coming, moving closer, heading toward the staircase. They were too heavy, too measured to belong to an animal. My stomach twisted into knots. "I think we should go," I said, already backing toward the stairs. Mason didn't argue this time. We hurried downstairs, but just as we reached the front door, something slammed it shut. Hard. We both stopped in our tracks, staring at the door in stunned silence. "Did you just see that?" Mason whispered. I didn't answer. My heart was hammering in my chest and my hands were shaking. I reached for the doorknob, but just as I touched it, we heard a sound behind us. A low, guttural noise like breathing. Slowly, we turned around. Standing at the far end of the hallway, just barely visible in the weak light of our flashlights, was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a man. Tall, gaunt, and completely still. I swallowed hard. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. Mason grabbed my arm. "Let's go," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I turned the doorknob, my hand slick with sweat, and pulled the door open. We bolted outside, sprinting to my truck without looking back. I didn't breathe until we were back on the road, the house fading into the distance behind us. And the next morning, we didn't talk about what had happened. Not right away. We both tried to act like it hadn't freaked us out, like it had just been some homeless guy squatting in the old house. But deep down, we knew better. Whatever we saw that night wasn't normal, and it wasn't human. A few days later, the local news reported that Harper's Bend had been torn down. It didn't surprise me. That place was cursed, and the town had finally decided to get rid of it. But the story didn't end there. About a week later, Mason came over to my house, pale and jittery. He had something in his hand, something small and wrapped in a dirty rag. "I went back," he said quietly, not looking me in the eye. "What?" I asked, stunned. "Why the hell would you do that?" He didn't answer. Instead, he unwrapped the rag, revealing what he had brought back from Harper's Bend. It was the doll, the same one he had found in the house that night. But something was different about it. Its eyes were gone, leaving behind two hollow black holes. The healer's touch. I had never been much of a believer in miracles. But in a town as small as Amarillo, Texas, stories travel fast. For weeks, everyone talked about a healer named Eli Mason who claimed he could cure any ailment with a single touch. People swore he'd healed them of diseases, injuries, even chronic pain that doctors couldn't fix. Normally, I would have ignored the buzz, but when my sister Clara insisted on going to one of Eli's gatherings, I went along to keep her company. Clara had been struggling with a heart condition for years, and though I was skeptical, I couldn't deny her hope. Eli held his healing sessions in a wide-open field outside town, drawing a crowd every time. We arrived just as the sun was setting, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The field was filled with people, some seated, some standing, all with their eyes on a makeshift stage where Eli was already speaking. He was a wiry man in his 30s, with piercing green eyes and a gentle but firm voice that somehow drew everyone in. He spoke about faith, the power of belief, and surrendering yourself to the healing. As I watched him move through the crowd, laying hands on people who would then collapse, weeping or shouting with relief, I felt an unsettling chill. There was something about his eyes, the way he looked at each person with a strange intensity that made me feel uneasy. Eventually, it was Clara's turn. She gripped my hand tightly as we walked up to Eli. He looked at her, his gaze softening as he took her hand and placed his palm over her chest. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, and for a moment I saw something dark flicker across his face, like a shadow. After a few seconds, he stepped back and Clara swayed, clutching her heart. I feel lighter," she murmured, her face pale but her eyes shining with relief. She hugged me tightly, crying with joy. I should have been happy for her, but something gnawed at me, a feeling that I couldn't shake. In the days that followed, Clara's health seemed to improve drastically. Her energy returned, her heart rate stabilized, and she even looked younger, as if years of stress had melted away. But the change came at a cost. She was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained, as though she'd lost something fundamental. Then strange things began happening. One night she woke up screaming, clutching her chest and gasping for breath. "He's in my dreams," she said, her voice trembling. "Eli, he's watching me, waiting." At first I thought it was just a reaction to the sudden change, maybe some kind of stress response. But every night she'd wake up around the same time, her eyes wide and filled with terror. She said Eli was always there, whispering to her, his face twisted, his eyes dark and hollow. One evening as we were having dinner, Clara excused herself to go to the bathroom, but she didn't come back. I found her standing in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at her reflection with a blank expression. She was muttering under her breath, her hands trembling. "Clara?" I called, but she didn't respond. When I shook her shoulder, she blinked, her eyes focusing as if she'd just woken up. I don't know what happened," she whispered, her voice faint. Over the next few weeks, her episodes grew worse. She started talking about strange visions, shadows moving in the corners of her room, and Eli's voice calling her name, urging her to come back to him. I tried convincing her to see a doctor, but she refused, saying it was part of the healing. One night, desperate for answers, I decided to visit Eli myself. I found him alone in the field, setting up for another session. He looked at me, his expression unreadable as I approached. "What's happening to my sister?" I demanded. He sighed, his gaze dropping. "Healing isn't as simple as people think," he replied. "Sometimes the spirit must give something up, to be free." "What did you take from her?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked away, his face etched with something like regret. "I didn't take anything. She gave it willingly. I warned her." "But she's suffering," I argued, my anger growing. "She's losing herself." He shook his head. "Sometimes to heal the body, the soul has to make a choice. Not everyone can handle that cost." I left, furious and terrified, realizing I'd been right all along. There was a darkness to Eli, something beyond his charisma and gentle smile. When I returned home, I found Clara in her bedroom, pale and trembling, She looked at me, her eyes hollow, and said, "He's here." "Who?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Eli," she whispered. "He's inside me." She explained that every night when she closed her eyes, she felt his presence, felt him taking something from her. "It's like he's feeding off me," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Every time I close my eyes, he gets stronger." I stayed with her that night, determined to protect her. But as midnight approached, Clara fell into a deep, almost unnatural sleep. I watched, helpless, as her breathing slowed, her body growing colder, her skin pale as if she were fading. And then, just before dawn, she opened her eyes and I saw a flash of green, the same piercing green as Eli's. I stepped back, heart pounding, as Clara looked at me, her gaze distant, unfamiliar. "It's him," she murmured, her voice layered with something else, something that wasn't her. The next morning I drove Clara to a doctor, but all her tests came back normal. No one believed me when I tried to explain what was happening. They thought it was stress, that she was overreacting, but I knew better. Desperate, I went back to the field one last time. This time it was empty, the makeshift stage abandoned. Eli was gone, and no one knew where he'd gone. It was as if he'd vanished, leaving nothing behind but a trail of broken people, each one haunted by his touch. Clara's condition continued to deteriorate. She became a shell of her former self, her once vibrant personality replaced by a blank, empty gaze. And every night I watched her sleep, waiting for the green to return to her eyes. For the moment she'd look at me and I'd see him staring back. One night just before dawn, I woke to find Clara standing by my bed, her face calm, her eyes piercing green. She looked at me, a faint smile on her lips, and whispered, "He's inside now. He's never leaving." She turned and walked out of the room, and I heard the front door open and close. I ran outside, calling her name, but she was gone, vanished into the darkness. I searched everywhere, but there was no trace of her. They say Eli reappears now and then, moving from town to town, leaving a trail of miracles behind him. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I hear Clara's voice, faint and distant, calling out to me, "Please, let me go." Thank you for joining me on this unsettling journey tonight. I hope these stories have left you with chills and maybe a few questions you're not quite ready to answer. If you felt the darkness in each tale, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Every bit of support helps keep these haunting stories alive. And before you go, let me know in the comments. Have you ever encountered something you just couldn't explain? Until next time, friends, sleep well, if you can.